Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Connect University of this autumn. This week, we will offer you to discover a lot of exciting sessions about the digital transformation at large and a lot about digital platforms and their role and the digital economy in more detail. We will look at the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, which are the foundational kind of important regulatory rules to govern the digital platforms. We will look at the role of data in the digital transition. We will look at the hot topic of artificial intelligence. We will look at issues such as disinformation, algorithmic transparency, and you name it. You will also learn about the digital identity, the e-wallet, and what it can do to help us to be secure when we are doing online transactions. And you will learn about latest generation of language technologies. Before we go into more detail into some of the sessions for today, Alex, who's here with me with some other colleagues, he will give you a short overview of this week's program. Alex, over to you.
Thank you, Renate. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the entire week of Connect University. Some of you might know it, some of you which saw the last year's Connect University. Again, this week we have one full week filled with events all around the online platforms ecosystem. We saw how much traction this has been getting, but we thought it would be a good idea to start, of course, from the DMA, DSA, and build around that and show the other policies or the other projects the Commission and its partners are doing in the area. The concept of the week is pretty easy. We have 2 sessions each day, one in the morning at 10, one in the afternoon at 2. Remember, if you cannot make it to any of the sessions, the recording will be available both on YouTube, on the Digital EU channel, as well as on Futurium, where you can also find the slides. I will briefly take you through the entire week. Renate already mentioned a few of the sessions that we have on hand. Again, today we will just begin by setting the stage. We will introduce the role and impact of platforms ecosystem, the place in its digital economy within and beyond the EU. The ecosystem cannot run safely without robust security. Thus, this afternoon at 2, we will continue with our session on cybersecurity skills. Next, online transactions on various platforms have become an integral part of our life. So for this, we will begin tomorrow morning with our session on the EU Digital Identity Wallet. In Tuesday afternoon, the session on language technologies will aim at showcasing a few initiatives and platforms that address the need of multiple communities in the area and reinforce the entire ecosystem. Wednesday morning, on our sessions on algorithm systems, we will go through how Connect, together with the European Centre for Algorithmic Transparency, plan to contribute with scientific and technical expertise to improve our understanding on how algorithms work. Further on, we've all seen the big impact disinformation had on platforms with, of course, recent examples in the areas of vaccinations, climate change, the war in Ukraine, you name it. For this, join us Wednesday afternoon on our session on disinformation and see what the Commission is doing to combat this. Thursday will be saved for our core topics of the week, which my colleagues here will approach briefly as well, beginning with the Digital Services Act in the morning and the Digital Markets Act in the afternoon. Lastly, Friday morning, we'll host a session on data platforms and data spaces, promoting data sharing via online platforms, the legislative activities, and technological developments. We will end the afternoon with the session on AI platforms, the buzzword everyone has been hearing in the last few months for sure. So I really hope that at least a few of the keywords spark some interest for you. And we hope to see you in all of the sessions where you can engage and ask questions to our speakers. Speaking of which, to start unpacking the platform ecosystems, we have with us today Renate Nicolai, Deputy Director General of DigiConnect, Maria Tsonim, Case Handler DMA Implementation, Mena Cox, Head of Sector F2 Digital Services, and Manuel Castella, Policy Assistant in the Coordination and Regulatory Compliance Unit. We will not take questions today because we have separate sessions each, as previously mentioned, on the DMA and on the DSA. So please try and save them until then. Thank you. Please, Renate, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alex. So let me try to kick us off with some of the big questions that we try to treat in governing a digital transition that is actually to our taste. Because when we are, as policymakers, as regulators, deciding on what should be the right rules for this digital transition, we are guided by some key questions that we have to ask ourselves, such as how can we enable and accompany technological progress whilst protecting our citizens and companies in a technological race, which we are observing? Or how can we keep our litigation fit for a constantly evolving digital platform ecosystem and a digital transformation that doesn't stop? Or how can we keep up our European values, which are constantly being challenged in the online world? And finally, how can we, deal with the big platforms which are so powerful in the world and which are so global only as Europeans? Well, I would say that, especially in this mandate, we have been very daring to open a new chapter in the digital transition and to come with some regulatory choices as the EU that are well prepared, but that they are also very much watched by the world because in many regards we are pioneering. I will talk to you about a couple of them today, just to highlight who we are, why we have done that, and what marks these regulatory choices. It's very clear that a digital transition cannot work without data. So therefore, it is important to have also, as part of the strategy to create our version of the digital transition, to accompany that with a data strategy. And here we were, of course, fortunate because we could build everything that we are doing on data on the foundation of our strong data protection rules. But we also had to move on, because if you want to use for European citizens and business interests the potential of the digital economy, you need to open space for data sharing. You need a data strategy that enables, in particular, industrial data to be used by innovators to come with good solutions. And this is very much at the heart of the data strategy that we have developed in this Commission, and on the basis of which we have also developed legal acts such as the Data Governance Act, or more recently the Data Act. Innovative European systems to break up silos so that big and small companies get more in the mood of sharing data, so that innovative solutions that will accompany smart mobility, smart housing, energy efficient solutions in whatever sector can be developed. And for that to flourish, we need the access to data. So this is an important statement to really untap the potential, to really make use of the data, very much based on what we had, as I said, decided before, that we want very strong data protection rules in Europe. It has to be built on it, but it has to be built with the spirit of privacy by design and really bringing the user in control of the data. That goes for personal data and for industrial data. As important as this signal, in particular for startups, to make their role and be a driver of the digital transition, is what we are doing in trying, as the first ones in the world, to actually find a regulatory framework for artificial intelligence. Everybody talks about that these days because of the generative AI, the foundation models, ChatGPT, and all the important developments. It's happening already. We will need AI solutions if we want kind of the personalized medicine of the future, if we want to have the virtualization of our industry. We want to embrace it, but we also want to take statements of what kind of AI solutions we want. We want trustworthy, human-centric AI. We want also to be aware that there are high-risk areas where we want ex ante a little bit more safeguards in it. And this is very much at the heart of the AI Act that we are at the moment negotiating and that we are hoping to finalize before the end of the year. With that statement of an AI Act that would kind of clarify certain red lines, otherwise have a very intelligent system of high-risk approach on AI, and otherwise open the floor for innovative solutions on AI, which we embrace also as an important industrial boost for Europe. We would again make a statement and kind of inspire, hopefully, others in the world to kind of come with us. Because as you might know, on AI, even though we have decided in the EU to go for a regulation, there's also a lot of talk, especially about in the international scene amongst allies, whether that's the G7 Hiroshima Plus context, whether that's our cooperation with the United States, because they have also engaged in more self-regulatory approaches, principles-based approaches. And of course, if we can unite, building on our AI Act, on these principles, also with partners in the world, that's even more important if we want to ensure that also globally we are moving in a certain direction on AI solutions that are trustworthy and human-centric and risk-based. But let me now kind of move to what I think is another very innovative piece of our work, which is the new rules for platforms. We have not started from scratch in this mandate to work on platform economy. We have done this already in the past. We had a period where we worked in particular with platforms in self-regulatory mode to deal with difficult developments such as hate speech or disinformation, and that has helped a great deal in preparing our rules, which are called the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. They are groundbreaking rules because, of course, platform economy has become part of our life, has enabled us to survive COVID in a much better way, to stay connected. We want to embrace the possibilities, but we have, unfortunately, also seen that, as it sometimes is with technology, it can offer huge chances, but it also can create potential harm. We have seen kind of echo chambers developing where radicalization and hate is flourishing. We have seen kind of the mushroom of illegal content that is not taken down early enough. We have seen that the protection of minors in the online space has become a societal issue. We have seen that marketplaces are not always kind of giving enough space to the protection of the consumers. And we have seen that big companies are using their power to create walled gardens and silos where innovation is kind of, not happening enough, and where, competitors are not getting their fair share to kind of develop their models. So this is very much at the heart of what we have tried to do with the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act to kind of, break silos, create a more competitive environment with more innovation, but also protect consumers and citizens more when they are surfing, when they are residents in that online environment. Of course, in particular, vulnerable groups such as minors. So what we have done with the Digital Services Act is, for instance, that we have a system now in place where for the very large online platforms, those that have, you will have the details in all the kind of sessions that will follow, but it's mainly those that have more than 45 million users per month. There, it's the Commission, it's us, it's the team in DG Connect that is in charge of kind of making sure that these platforms are really obliging the law with the law. We have designated a first kind of batch of very large online platforms. The rules for them have kicked in at the end of August. They had to present their first risk assessment. We are in the process of assessing this risk assessment, and we are in the process of kind of sending questions back to them and challenging whether they are doing enough to mitigate the risks that they can, of course, create if they simply simply do not pay attention to the echo chambers that they have, to the lack of transparency that they create, and this is what we are taking very seriously. There is a huge expectation that when it comes, for instance, on illegal content online, when it comes to the safety of marketplaces and the rights of consumers when using these marketplaces, when it comes to minor protection, when it comes to election integrity, that we can really see good developments over the coming months, and that we see that the business models of the very large online platforms are adapting to these new rules. We are seeing good first signals already. We are seeing platforms that have already changed some of the aspects, but we will be watchdogs. We will be taking our role as digital regulators very seriously to make sure that they not only kind of, say certain things, but they actually also do it. And we will take the means of this rule of the Digital Services Act that could even enable us in the steps to be followed, eventually to even fine the big platforms. We will not hesitate to kind of even use all our tools at our disposal. The other important piece is the Digital Markets Act, and that's more, an act that will really aim at kind of, open the space for more competition, dealing with the aspects that some of these platforms have created their system where there is not enough interoperability, where there is not enough choice to kind of, get other possibilities, for app developer, for site loading, and you name it, for, deciding what data is used for what kind of system on these kind of, big kind of, gatekeepers structures. And here again, in order to get ready for the application of the law at the beginning of September, we designated a first kind of group of gatekeepers, and this means that now they have to kind of, enter with us in compliance kind of discussions. They have started. You will also hear more about that. We again are working under tight deadlines. We're doing this together with the friends and colleagues from DG Competition, and we will have until March next year to really then showcase whether the gatekeepers again have adapted their system so that they are less of kind of, gatekeepers with walled gardens, but actually opening up more. I can also kind of share with you that these groundbreaking rules are being watched carefully worldwide because we have had that experience of the self-regulatory cooperation with the platforms, but also with the ecosystem of enforcement structures around it, which is also the civil society, the fact checkers, the media authorities, and it's an interesting kind of process that's being watched worldwide, because the harm that we are discussing, that we are trying to kind of mitigate for society, is not only happening in Europe, but of course also in other parts of the world. So that's why, as much as we are focusing at the moment on enforcing these rules in Europe, we also take it very seriously to reach out to partners, international organizations, but also partners in the world who, whatever continent we're talking about, are also discussing how they can kind of, tidy up their system a bit more so that it's a safer, a more open, a more transparent online environment. And if they can get inspired by our rules, such as the Digital Services Act or the Digital Markets Act, then we want to really make our contribution to that. So to conclude, my personal aim as kind of, being in a leading role in DG Connect to support the team and guide the team in this kind of, first year as enforcers of the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act is clearly to be able to showcase when we kind of have an important democratic moment for us in Europe, which is the European Parliament elections next June, to showcase that the things have changed, that there is an impact of our new rules on kind of the structures to protect minors in the online environment, that there are marketplaces that are easier to use and that give more rights and empowered consumers more, that we have less illegal content that stays long and goes viral massively on the platforms, but also that we kind of, have a system where we can ensure in a better systemic way election integrity, and not last but not least that we have a structure of big platforms that are more interoperable, where things can flourish more, where we have more innovative choices than we have today. So this is our task, and we take it very seriously. And with that, I give over to my colleagues here with me in the room, Manuel, Maria, and Menno, who will now kind of guide you through individual topics that I've mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renata. So for the rest of the session, what we want to do is go through a quick high-level overview of essentially the why we do actually regulate the online platform ecosystem. Why is it that this is important? I will also give a quick, very brief introduction to the perspective of the Digital Services Act. My colleague Maria will give a perspective a little bit more on the Digital Markets Act, and my colleague Menno will then talk about the international perspective of platform regulation. So without further ado, we start from the very beginning. So why is it that we regulate? Why do we regulate online platforms and the online ecosystem? So I barely have to say anything regarding the societal impact of digital services online. They permeate both our society and economy, and there are a myriad of examples that we can give right now, from online marketplaces where we can buy a variety of things, from chat applications where we can message our family or our work colleagues, to social media where we stay in touch with from our closest friends to celebrities. It has permeated so many different aspects of our lives, and this is one of the core reasons why we regulate. It is also a world that is it's accelerating exponentially. It is becoming bigger and bigger for the economy and for society, and it will continue to get bigger. This brings a lot of opportunities, but it brings a lot of challenges precisely for how many layers of society it permeates. Not only that, but as my colleague will explain afterwards, it has a global perspective to it. The digital services are inherently cross-border. We are using apps that come from several different continents and which have services all over the 27 states, and even European platforms have reach outside of Europe. And then one of the challenges that we find here, and one of the other reasons why we regulate, is that because this is a cross-border issue, we cannot have fragmented rule sets. This means that for the European Union, we cannot have 27 ways of approaching problems that we all face together, especially when those issues are coming from platforms that are coming from other countries, and especially when the problems are global and they're common to all of us. So we've talked about the benefits, but what are the risks that we encounter online? What are the risks that we want to tackle? So to give some examples, first would be the dissemination of illegal content. By this we mean, for example, illegal hate speech. We would mean terrorist content. We also have negative effects on fundamental rights. A very big example that people can quickly identify with is freedom of speech. We want to avoid, for example, when there is content renewal without any explanation, or, for example, the phenomenon known as shadow banning, when your content essentially is Hello, everyone, and sorry for the technical issues that we've experienced. We've seen in the comments that some people said if we were shadow banned. We can assure you we were not. We will continue with the presentation talking about the negative effects on civil discourse, electoral processes, and public safety. These are especially important, especially regarding the issue of disinformation and misinformation, especially considering the many elections, very crucial elections in the European Union that are coming next year. Finally, another example that we have is the negative effects on minors, public health, mental and physical well-being, and gender violence. Here, we see again the issue of disinformation, for example, the disinformation on vaccines, which we all know happened during the pandemic. We saw another example is online harassment. And of course, the issue of minors, which I will touch in a bit, the issue who are targeted by illegal content and targeted content that should not be targeted to minors. So to give more specific examples, here we have the one big issue, which is hate speech. Hate speech is an EU-wide problem that is currently increasing in scale. Evidence gathered in recent studies indicates that there is an increase in the scale of hate speech and hate crimes, which is a concern in many, many member states, and it concerns several grounds of hate speech, so on race, origin, sexuality, and gender. And another great problem that we're facing, another example, is disinformation. Disinformation, you might see that there was the latest report stemming from the Code of Practice, which was published in September, and it revealed some worrying figures. So, for example, we can see in this recent report that in some platforms, mis- and disinformation actually receives more engagement than non-mis- or disinformation posts, which is a growing issue that we need to tackle as regulators. And then finally, we have the issue of the protection of minors. This is becoming very, very important to tackle, mostly because young people's use of and exposure to social media is very, very much on the rise, to the point that in certain member states and certain platforms have a reach to up to 95% of population between 13 and 17, which means that they are exposed already to these platforms, and they need to comply in the knowledge that they have the reach of many minor users. So here we go to the issue of the DSA. So when we tackle a law like the DSA that wants to tackle all of these risks, who does the law apply to? Because it would have to tackle a variety of actors. And indeed, the Digital Services Act targets intermediaries, it targets hosting services, it targets online platforms, and finally, like Renate mentioned, the VLOPs and VLOSes, the very large online platforms, and the very large online search engines. Now, these are the ones that have a reach of over 45 million users in the EU. And of course, when we're talking about this wide array of actors, the law cannot apply the same way to intermediaries than to VLOPs and VLOSes, who actually have a much wider reach and therefore present a much higher risk to the population. This is why when we see that even though VLOPs and VLOSes are fewer in number, if we look at the obligations under the DSA, we will see that these are cumulative, meaning that if we see here in the slide that intermediaries would be the ones with the least obligations, they would only have to comply with these in blue. So transparency reporting, having clear terms and conditions, establishing clear points of contact, and legal representatives. And then we would go up and up in more and more obligations to hosting services, online platforms, and finally, we would arrive to the big platforms in the EU who would have to go through all of these due diligence obligations that you see below, and most importantly, as Renate mentioned, the risk management yearly cycle. Every year we will see what it is that they are doing and if there are new risks that are arising. So one could say easily that the Commission may not have the capacity to actually enforce all of these, but we are not at all alone. The structure that we will use in enforcing this will be aided by the digital services coordinators. These will be at national level, will help directly supervise and enforce platforms that have less than 45 million users. Together, these national services coordinators will form the European Board for Digital Services, which will help and counsel the European Commission. And the European Commission will be in direct will take into account the direct enforcement of the very large online platforms. So they will take care of the biggest and most cross-border of the actors that have to comply with the DSA. And with this, I leave it to my colleague Maria, who will now give us the perspective on the Digital Markets Act. Over to you, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you, Manuel. It's a pleasure actually being here. Indeed, I will refer a little bit on the Digital Markets Act. As far as I know, you have planned a 2-hour session on Thursday on this, but I'm sure you cannot wait to listen a little bit more information until then, beyond what Renato already mentioned. Let's see a little bit here. What we have is what is exactly the Digital Markets Act, an horizontal legislation applicable to core platform services which are designated by the EU and they're offered in the EU by those gatekeepers. It's an ex-ante regulation, so we're not waiting until the behavior to happen, but we are regulating before. Under the DMA, the Commission can designate those digital platforms as gatekeepers if they provide an important gateway between businesses and consumers. It's a very important regulation in the sense that it ensures fair and contestable markets in the digital sector. It empowers the end users. It provides a lot of opportunities for the business users. And how do they do that? We have very clearly defined obligations. They're applicable to those gatekeepers, and to give you a little bit more sense of where we are now with respect to this, the regulation applied actually on 2nd of May of this year. We started receiving all the notifications from the potential gatekeepers on 3rd of July. The Commission had a very strict deadline, so only 45 working days to take those decisions, whether those companies are designated gatekeepers or not, which we did on 6th of September. And the companies now have a 6 months period to make sure that they will comply with those obligations, meaning by 7th of March of 2024. Just to give you a little bit more of idea what we're looking at, so here you can see the gatekeepers to the left, all this colorful, nice chart. So you have Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, ByteDance, Meta, and Microsoft. And then to the right, you have all the core platform services for which they have been designated, 22 in total. And if you see, the colors actually correspond to the core platform services. So Alphabet, for Google Maps, Google Play, Google Shopping, for example, are the intermediation services of Alphabet. TikTok is of ByteDance, that you most likely know as TikTok. And apart from that, the Commission on 6th of September, at the same time, opened 4 market investigations. Because there were certain companies that submitted rebuttal requests, although they were meeting certain thresholds as defined by the Digital Markets Act. And the Commission needed to open formal investigation to assess whether this is the case or not. These concerns Bing Edge, Microsoft advertising of Microsoft, and iMessage of Apple. And at the same time, the Commission opened a formal investigation into Apple's iPadOS. You can see that iOS is actually designated as one of the core platform services of Apple, but iPadOS did not meet the thresholds. Still, the Commission thought that it might need to assess whether they are a gateway between businesses and consumers, so opened a formal investigation there too. And towards, we're working the compliance, and we're having all these conversations that also Renata mentioned. We need to make sure to monitor the implementation, and should they not comply with them, there are certain fines that are foreseen in the long run, which can be up to 10% of their worldwide turnover, and for repetitive offenses, it can be up to 20%. I'm sure you will hear more information on Thursday, so I don't want to burden you too much with details, so I will pass the floor to my colleague Meno now.
Thank you very much, Maria, and good morning to all. Now we move from the domestic enforcement to global platform governance, which are both one and the same thing, and I'll come back to explaining why that is. But let me start by highlighting something crucial when we talk about the global effects and global governance of online platforms. And that's something that Renata and Manuel already mentioned. So the importance of cooperating with global partners is that we have a shared problem statement and that we aim, in principle, to safeguard universal principles. So reaching out to a demand from across the world that is there regardless of whether we answer it or not, revolves around safeguarding universal principles. This is not to promote the EU way of regulating online platforms per se. And if we look at this slide at the 2 bullets in bold, we can have a quick look at what some of those universal principles are all about. If we take the Digital Services Act, you see it here formulated as citizen agency over platforms to surface quality content. Now, what is really crucial here is the focus on the citizen, and the citizen, with that we refer to society at large. Regulation is not there to give anyone power over content moderation online. Regulation actually recognizes that some form of oversight through binding rules is necessary to rebalance the inherent struggle between different fundamental rights online so that everyone, all in society, can effectively safeguard their own fundamental rights, including freedom of expression and safety, the respect for your physical and mental integrity. The regulation tries to give this agency precisely by preventing that government has too much power, that platforms have too much power, or that any single citizen, like a trusted flagger, has too much power and oversteps their role. If we then go to the Digital Services Act in particular, we can also start to discern how these universal principles, fundamental rights principles, as they are also laid down in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, are translated into hard law in the EU. And what is very important to point out at first is something that maybe we talk about less when presenting the Digital Services Act, which is the fact that with the adoption of the Digital Services Act, the 27 EU governments came together to confirm that they still adhere to this self-imposed ban on general monitoring obligations. This was already in the e-commerce directive from 2000, and it was confirmed. This is, of course, a very strong signal to the rest of the world that the 27 EU governments commit domestically to not imposing general monitoring, which would inherently come to the detriment of all of our free expression, and that this is not the way to go about safeguarding all fundamental rights, rebalancing them online. This confirmation of the ban is linked to the design of the Digital Services Act, which is a risk-based impact assessment approach for human rights, which takes into account all of the fundamental societal concerns that Manuel outlined earlier, but includes, of course, as he also said, in that risk, a restriction of our free expression, which could come with general monitoring and incentives for platforms to, for instance, over-remove content, which can actually be managed better if citizens are informed and empowered. So this differential approach to this, depending on the size of online platforms, as highlighted earlier very nicely in the chart with concentric circles, is necessary to balancing the various fundamental rights online. This is not about preventing, in all cases, that we are exposed as citizens to certain risks. This is about informing us about those risks and about holding online platforms to their role to mitigate those risks to the reasonable extent, to the extent necessary. So these are some examples of universal principles in the Digital Services Act, and we can highlight more, but let's also look at why domestic enforcement is also catering to the international effects and the need to have a global approach when regulating these global platforms. Now, the first thing that stands out is that we in the EU talk specifically about single market rules. It was already mentioned, it wouldn't work to have 27 different legal regimes, both because startup companies as well as larger online platforms would have to comply with 27 different rules, also potentially on how to organize their systems, their procedures to notify and remove content. But of course, more so than that, we need also a way to make sure the 27 get the balance of fundamental rights correct and consistently correct. So the Digital Services Act also allows or ensures that the Commission, as guardian of the treaties, safeguards the treaties also in the implementation of these single market rules. So there is an important cross-border aspect already within the EU, which makes this an international instrument. This is also to safeguard cross-border access to information. We as EU citizens can access any news source from any EU member state without hindrance. Then, why is domestic enforcement also important for the rest of the world? And I mention this because domestic enforcement of balanced platform regulation outside the EU would also benefit us within the EU. So here are a few examples of why this is also important for the rest of the world. The first, you could see already, is that there is a direct global effect of these platform rules because the EU will now be building up commercial auditing capabilities on very novel and difficult topics like the artificial intelligence impact of algorithmic systems on societal risks identified in the Digital Services Act. So algorithmic auditing capabilities will eventually benefit the world as we move to global platform regulation in all of the different parts of the world. The EU is also building up now enforcement experience because, as you've heard from Manuel and Maria, both the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act are now in force and kicking in, and the European Commission, as the central EU regulator, is gaining crucial experience with how to go about making these rules a success in practice. And on top of that, both sets of rules require online platforms, but also stakeholders beyond platforms, such as advertisers, trusted flaggers, and others, to report to the public about their activities. An example is that platforms will have to issue an even audited report on their targeted advertising done to their users under the Digital Markets Act. They will have to maintain repositories of ads targeting their users under the Digital Services Act. And trusted flaggers will have to issue reports on their activities so that everyone can see that they play their role proportionally and in line with their expertise, also under the Digital Services Act. And the list goes further. There are benefits from research that will be made public under the Digital Services Act on problems that we see in the EU, that are EU-specific, but that, of course, also resonate in other parts of the world. Then, of course, I'll move to the last bullet. There would be an important global effect if platforms find it easier to implement remedies under the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, recognizing that these safeguard universal principles at a global level. But this time we'll have to tell whether that will happen. What we can do is make sure that we facilitate a global dialogue on these crucial topics. Now an example of one of these direct global effects that we already see today. This is a screenshot of a new database launched by the European Commission under the Digital Services Act that, as at Friday last week, contained 30 million notices provided by online platforms regarding illegal content or content that breached their terms and conditions. And this was up to 52 million this morning already, although not in time to take a new screenshot. But you will see that this allows global research on an anonymized set of statements of reasons because this database is public to all, it's not geofenced, and it covers some of the phenomena that we share around the world, around disinformation, around counterfeit goods, and much, much, much beyond. So based on a privacy-preserving database, everyone, global researchers, can now use this as a tool for good. Another example dates to a little bit longer ago. There was a workshop in February under the Digital Markets Act where, with the help of one gatekeeper, this gentleman that you see with the Matrix t-shirt, the CEO of Matrix, was able to demo in real time that interoperability between messenger services can work using client-side bridging in order to preserve end-to-end encryption. He made it work with the help of a gatekeeper that also stands to benefit from the obligations in the Digital Markets Act. And it simply shows to the rest of the world that you can offer more innovation with proportionate rules and while preserving all of the standards that we adhere to and that are also universal principles. These are quite powerful examples of what these rules can do and what we as EU citizens would also stand to benefit from if they are implemented in the same manner in third jurisdictions. A final word on how this fits in with the EU's general digital diplomacy efforts, and that is that the DSA and the DMA, the two legal acts we are talking about today, they translate, as I mentioned, these universal and EU fundamental rights principles into hard law in the EU. And similarly, the EU member states, together with the Parliament and Commission, have issued a solemn declaration on digital rights and principles that their citizens should expect and have preserved in the digital decade in the EU. And these principles, these institutions commit to upholding within the EU and then also project outside the EU. And you see here a paragraph highlighted in red that explains what those principles are when we are talking about platform regulation in particular. With that, I would hand back because I think everything will be talked about in more detail during the rest of this week. And thank you for your attention.
Indeed, thank you. And we did have some specific questions on gatekeepers. And as mentioned in the chat, our recommendation is to join us Thursday afternoon on the session on the DMA, and of course, as well on the session in the morning on the DSA. If nobody else, do we have anything else to add? No? Great. Then thank you all for joining this intro session. I hope we gave you a touch of what's about to come this entire week. and we hope to see everyone soon with your questions on the sessions in each day this entire week. Thank you and have a great day.